Okay, welcome to part 3 of my 3-part review series on the Mosin Nagant 91/30 rifle. This section will cover primarily history of the 91/30 rifle, as well as that of its predecessors, and some of its carbine variants as well. This section will neglect mechanics because when I tried to do that with the Mauser series, the video lasted for about half an hour long. And I just don't want to do that. I aimed for this video to be about 20 to 25 minutes. So, that being said, welcome, and I hope you enjoy it. Before I really start, I just want to say thank you to the YouTube user That Evil Midget. He's a self-described Mosin Nagant nerd, and he's a Mosin Nagant collector. He corrected some mistakes that I made in part 2, and then he was kind enough to share his wealth of knowledge regarding the Mosin's history and all its little variants, and just little itty-bitty details that I probably would have missed in my own research. So again, thank you very much. The Mosin Nagant design comes from two gentlemen, Sergei Mosin, a Russian, and Leon Nagant, a Belgian who also invented the Nagant revolver, also used by the Russians. Now the rifle is almost all Mosin designed, with the exception of the magazine, which has Nagant's magazine with the inclusion of the interrupter, which prevents rim lock for the most part. Now the design was originally called it was originally adopted as the 3-line rifle model of 1891. Now line, I'm not sure if that's a correct pronunciation or not, is a unit of measurement equivalent to 1/10 of an inch. So 3 lines makes 3/10 of an inch or 30 caliber. And it was originally invented as a replacement for the aging Berdan II rifle used by the Russians. It was an old obsolescent single-shot black powder, big bore black powder, I want to say, 10.35 millimeters, if memory serves me right. And basically, everyone else by the late 1880s, early 1890s had gone to the magazine-fed repeating rifles, and smokeless powder had made its appearance as well. So the Russians decided it was time to adopt a new rifle. When the Mosin Nagant was originally introduced in 1891, it came in 3 varieties. The first was an infantry long rifle. The second was a shortened rifle for dragoons, which were cavalry. And the last one was a Cossack rifle, which was again a shortened rifle for Cossacks, which are kind of special cavalry. They're an ethnic group, actually, I believe, and they're rather famous in Russian military literature, and they come from the steppes of Russia. I'll go a bit into each one of them, but this is actually not any of those 3. This rifle here in front of you is a Soviet 91/30, which derives most of its features from the Dragoon rifle. So I'll go I'll cover each of these a little bit, but I eventually want to focus on the 91/30. Okay, I just want to quickly cover the 7.62 by 54 millimeter rimmed cartridge and its history as far as it pertains to the Mosin Nagant. Of course, its service continues to this very day in the hands of the Russian Armed Forces, giving it the cartridge with the longest career award. Now, the only other military cartridge that from that era that's also rimmed, bottlenecked centerfire, smokeless powder cartridge from that year that I can think of that exists in popular use today is the 303 British, but the 7.62 has got it beat both in ballistics and service length. The 7.62 by 54 millimeter rimmed cartridge, otherwise known as 7.62 Russian, began its life in 1891. These here are Cold War era cartridges, but they're just here for demonstration. And the originals would have had a brass case, I believe, and a 212 grain round nose lead core bullet with a copper nickel jacket, giving it a silvery appearance. These here aren't copper nickel. These are copper plated with a color on them for steel core, I believe. Muzzle velocity was 2,020 feet per second, or 615 meters per second, which is quite slow if you think about it. They updated the cartridge in 1908 because in 1905 the Germans went to a Spitzer design, and being that this was pre-World War I Europe, where everyone was embroiled in a giant arms race, all the other European countries, including Russia, followed suit. And the 1908 configuration cartridge is basically what fed the Mosin Nagant until it ended its service. The 1908 configuration cartridge has a 147 grain projectile flying at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, or 855 meters per second, a significant increase. It required a change in the sights, the rear sight of the rifles, and I'll cover that a bit later. Power-wise, it's about the same as 30-06, 7.92 by 57 millimeter Mauser, 7.62 NATO. Within a those rounds within a military context will drop people about the same. The only real thing I can think about, which may hinder points for the 7.62 Russian, is the rim, which makes it a bit harder for machine gun designs. But history-wise, I think that's about it. The Soviets went to a steel case and a copper jacket, but that's about it. I mean, ballistically, it's the same as the 1908 cartridge. And history-wise, I think that's all I really need to cover. Okay, and on to the rifles. This here is not, it's a 91/30 rifle, which was a Soviet modification, but I'm going to have it for demonstration purposes, just, because it's the only Mosin Nagant that I own. And I'm going to start off with the M91 long rifle, the infantry long rifle, but you'll see this one as well when I talk about the Dragoon and Cossack rifles. Anyways, the M91 long rifle was, as its name implies, a long rifle. Its barrel length was 31.5 inches long, whereas the 91/30 has a barrel length of 28 3/4 inches. Overall length was about 51 inches. If I'm wrong, I'll stick in a subtitle with the correction on there. But it's a bit of a historically ironic fact that the first Mosin Nagants were actually not produced in Russia, I want to say. They were eventually produced at 3 factories, Tula, Ijevsk, and Sestoyetsk. But the French were contracted to build 500,000 Mosin Nagants because probably the Russian factories were just tooling up, or they were experiencing delays, something along those lines. Anyways, the first iteration of the long rifle, the Russians obviously modified them several times, adding things, changing things, deleting things. But the first iteration was a bit of an oddity. It had no top handguard, so if you decided to shoot off 15 rounds quickly and then touch the barrel, you'd probably get burned. In addition, it had no provision in any way for mounting a sling. It had no sling swivels, and they had no slots, which was actually a later addition. It was a revision, actually. It had no recoil crossbolt. Actually, they were eventually added. The first ones were wood. The later ones were steel, as you see here. It had a pinky rest underneath the hand. I'm not sure. It's not a pistol grip, but this straight grip here. It had a pinky rest, which was a separate piece of metal, separate from the housing, the trigger housing. And that was eventually deleted in one of their subsequent modifications. Whoops, sorry. The early Mosin Nagant receivers, you'll hear this a lot used by importers and collectors and sellers, at gun shops. The early ones up to 1935 or 1936 were hexagonal. They're called hex receivers. Whoever, in the English-speaking world, whoever gave it that name clearly did not pass 6th grade geometry, because they are in fact octagonal in shape. But minor points aside, continuing on. The rear sight, the original rear sight was calibrated for the 212 grain round nose bullet that flew at 2,020 feet per second. It was a flip-up ladder sight. And that's how you would have adjusted elevation. This here is just a common ramp. So in 1908, as I mentioned, the Russians went to the Spitzer bullet, giving significantly faster muzzle velocity, so they had to change their sight to what's called the Konevalov sight. That's the one you see most often with these old rifles, associated with these old rifles. That's the odd-looking one with steps in it, and I'll probably put up a picture now, just to show you. And they would have been measured in a unit called arshin, the plural of that being arshini, which was equal, I believe, to 28 inches. You know, supposedly it's equal to the pace of the Tsar. But as I mentioned, they modified the long rifle several times. They added a handguard, in case I didn't mention that, so you wouldn't burn yourself. But eventually what happened was the Soviets decided to just get rid of the long rifle. They decided to get rid of the Dragoon and the Cossack rifles and just have one rifle for everybody. That would be the 91/30. And I'll cover that later, but first I'm going to go through the Dragoon and Cossack rifles. Okay, so the Dragoon and Cossack rifles I'm going to talk about at the same time because dimensionally I'm fairly certain they're more or less identical. They both were shortened versions of the M91 long rifle with a very short barrel length of 28 3/4 inches. I know, really short, huh? We consider today a 20-inch barrel to be a full-length rifle barrel. So, at different times. But anyways, the Dragoons were mounted infantry and the Cossacks were devoted cavalry. Not just the Cossack rifle, I meant to say, was for devoted cavalry. The Dragoon rifle was sighted with a bayonet attached, whereas the Cossack rifle was sighted in without the bayonet attached. Because if you're a devoted cavalryman, why carry around a bayonet when you have a saber, right? Just for that you win style points, and it would have been just one more thing to carry in the saddle, so it was just impractical. That's all I really have to say about them. They went through the same modifications as the M91 long rifle. They went to the Konevalov sight. They had slings attached. Obviously, if you're cavalry, you have to have slings attached. I think they did have slings from the start. But they went from sling swivels mounted on the bottom of the magazine and the bottom of the the front barrel band, rather, to these slots in the stock, which are just holes where you basically slip through a leather belt apparatus. And from there, you attach your sling, and of course, there's one in the butt as well. The Dragoon and Cossack rifles, were only different in that, as I mentioned, the bayonet sightings. The Dragoon was sighted in with the bayonet attached, whereas the Cossack wasn't. And the Cossack rifles have three stampings on them, which we consider in the Western world to be letters K, A, and the number 3. Obviously, in Russian, in the Cyrillic alphabet, they correspond to something else. But the Soviets in 1930, basically decreed that all new rifles and all older rifles should be updated to the 91/30 configuration, the configuration of 1930. So you'll see a lot of ex-Dragoons. They're called ex-Dragoons and ex-Cossack rifles that have just been updated to the 91/30 configuration. The next biggest change in the Mosin Nagant design occurred in 1930 with the adoption of the 91/30 rifle. It was ordered by the Revolutionary War Council, and they just standardized everything alongside that of the earlier Dragoon rifle, with some cosmetic changes. Contrary to common belief, this was not when the round receiver, which you see before you, was adopted. Hexagonal receivers, in reality octagonal receivers, but whatever, those stayed in production until 1935 at Izhevsk, in 1936 at Tula. The Sestoyets factory ceased production in 1918 because it was too close to the Finnish borders for the new Bolshevik government to feel comfortable with. Aside from that, the next biggest change, again cosmetic, just purely cosmetic in nature, was the rear sight. The rear sight you see before you is of a standard conventional ramp type. They abandoned that weird-looking, I forget the name of it, the Konevalov sight. They abandoned that and went over to a rear sight, a standard ramp rear sight. And then they also changed the barrel bands. They went over to a split design. It's just a different shape. They both perform the same function, but it's now split as opposed to its previous configuration. And they changed the front sight as well. Previously, the sights on Mosin Nagants were all blades. If you're ever looked at a Mauser, you know what I'm talking about. Then in the 91/30 standardized around a post and hood design. Most people call it a post and globe, referring to its shape. The globe's a bit unique because it has actually a small hole at the top to let in some light to shine upon the post there. Those are the biggest differences. I'm sure there's some others. Obviously, when the Bolsheviks took over, they went from the stampings on the receivers and all the metal work and the woodwork changed over from Imperial to Soviet, obviously. And that's really, the biggest way to tell your rifle, is to look and identify all the stampings. The one you see in front of you is a 1943 Ijevsk, and you can tell, obviously, the Soviets were under wartime pressures when the Germans invaded, so they started taking cost-saving measures. The polishings on the underside of the bolts are a bit rough. The inside of the chamber, you can see the quality of the workmanship isn't quite good. And I'm also going to show you the barrel. I'm going to take the handguard off the barrel and show you that the lathe marks are still visible. And if you rub your thumb along it, you can still hear you can actually hear it. Okay, so I've gone ahead and removed the handguard. I just want to show you this because it's a bit of a interesting history. You can see these two gouge marks, slash marks in the wood in the top handguard. And you might not be able to tell, but there's a very long crack going through them as well. That was done not by me, it was done by my father. What happened was, I didn't tell him I bought this rifle, and I brought it home one day, and he got pissed. So he took the rifle came with its goodies, so he took the cruciform bayonet, and he kind of chased me around the garage with it in his fury. And then, and he was actually trying to damage the rifle, and he succeeded. He smacked it across the top of the handguard here, and you can see where the edges, the flanges of the cruciform bayonet landed, and then consequently there's a huge crack along here now. But I'm going to keep that because it kind of looks like battle damage. He still owes me a new handguard, but I don't think I want to get it fixed because I wanted to keep it as a memento and just kind of rub it in my dad's face because he gets angry all too easily. Anyways, going to the lathe marks, you can't see it because of the quality of the camera, that being very poor, but if you rub your thumbnail against it, you can hear that zipping sound, which goes to show you that, of course, they call it the Great Patriotic War for a reason, but they were concerned primarily, as I mentioned earlier, primarily with turning out a larger quantity of rifles as opposed to fewer rifles with higher quality, which is why pre-war, Mosin Nagant 91/30 rifles are a bit more desirable, but in reality they all function the same. Some are smoother than others. This one's smoother than my friend's. His has got sticky bolts. But I'm also going to show you another cost-saving measure they took as well. Another thing they did to save time and cut costs during the Second World War when they were under great pressure was that they didn't mill out as much metal on this side of the receiver as they had previously. That's how we get the designation high wall, which you see here. What you see is a rather high wall of metal right here. Low wall receivers have a great portion of this metal milled away. I'm going to put up a picture showing that. And just the quality of the metalwork is a bit, leaves a bit to be desired. You can still see, you can't really see it, but if you look on the inside here, you can still see lathe marks. If you put a light into the chamber, you can still see a lot of lathe marks. If you look at the design of the bolts, well, not the design, but just the workmanship on the bolt, you can see on the interior here, there's a lot of, they look like kind of like circles, like when you draw crayons as a kid, you go in circles. That's what they look like here. You can see those on the bottom here. You can kind of see them. You can also see on the inside of the cocking piece here, this inside bit, there's a lot of, the machining isn't as great as you'd like it to be. And this could be the design, of the, obviously this bolt is probably a mixture of parts, a post-war refurb. I don't know if it's the design or not, but there's just a lot of, play in the bolt design. If you stick it into the rifle, okay, awkward angle, so it's taking me longer than I want. Come on, there we go. If you in the rifle itself, it also has a lot of, it's something that I don't like, but I put up with because, it could be the design of the rifle, it could be the workmanship, I don't know. But, to be honest, I really do like this rifle. You saw me in a shoot-off with a friend previously. I scored 2 hits, he scored 0. So obviously, excuse me, this rifle has obviously served me quite well, and I'm quite happy with it, even if the workmanship isn't what it could be. Okay, so the last Mosin Nagant designs were the carbines, the M38, the M44 and the M91/59, which is a bit of a mystery. The M38 and the M44 are basically cut down 91/30s. They were manufactured that way though, although some were built on recycled receivers, so you might see some M38s and M44s with hexagonal receivers. It's possible. And the M38 and M44 were issued to soldiers whose primary duties, were, like carrying radios or driving trucks or something that where a full-length rifle was impractical. So they gave them a carbine. The M44 had a side-mounted bayonet, which was actually a direct inspiration for the SKS bayonet, but it was just mounted on the side there, and it would have swung out and locked up in the front. The M38 had no bayonet, and I'm sure you could attach one to it though. And the M91/59 is a bit of a mystery. No one knows why it exists. It's a cut-down M91/30 receiver with a short barrel, 20 1/4 inches again, and the best way to tell is that the sight ramp has all graduations above 10 milled off, and nobody really knows why they exist. So that's about it. I hope I covered everything, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll have more reviews coming up later.